Prayers. Let us pray. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we humbly pray you, upon your servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that we may all, in all things, walk before you with steadfast purpose and single heart, and faithfully serve in our several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. O Lord our God, you are the lover of justice and truth. Give your grace to our Parliament, to all who direct the affairs of our nation, and guide us by your Holy Spirit, we pray, that by word and deed we may promote the well-being of this people and set forward peace among all people, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And now may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President.
I received the following message from Her Excellency the President, dated 19th July, 2023. And it reads as follows. Dear Mr. President, I shall be away from the island on duty leave on 20th July, 2023. In accordance with the provisions of Section 33 of the Constitution, the Very Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Douglas Gibson will perform the functions of the office of the President during my absence. As the Honourable, the Senate will not be meeting prior to my departure. It will not be possible for the usual formal message to be sent to your chamber. Will you, therefore, please bring my absence formally to the attention of the Honourable, the Senate, when next it meets? And is signed by Her Excellency, the President of Barbados.
Announcements by Your Honour.
I have received for confirmation the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, July 5th, 2023. Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move the confirmation of the minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday, July 5th, 2023.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, July 5th, 2023 be confirmed. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it, those minutes are confirmed.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers.
Before we get there, I have further announcements, Mr. Clerk, just a second, still on announcements. I have an indication.
Beg your pardon, sir.
Yes, I have an indication of late arrival from Senators Maynard and Tate, and excuses for absence on overseas duties, Senator Paris and Senator Walcott, and Senator Nichols. Further announcements, I want to congratulate one of our colleagues who is by definition the most fit and capable of us all, Senator Dr. Christina Hines, a member of the Barbados hockey team that captured bronze in the CAC Games very recently. We're very, very, very proud of your achievements and that of the team, but it also shows the depth, width, and diversity of the Senate of Barbados. I want to acknowledge, those were announcements, the presence of Mr. Gareth Sandyford, son of our fourth Prime Minister, Sir Lloyd Sandyford. And as you are aware, we will be, when we get to that item in the agenda, paying tribute. So I just want to acknowledge your presence and once again, from this floor and for the record, offer our sympathy to you and Angelina Lady Sandyford and other, Inga, other members of the family on your loss, but thanks also for the contribution of your dad to our development.
Presentation of papers.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following documents: the annual report and audited financial statements of the Caves of Barbados Limited for the year ended March 31st, 2022, the annual report and audited financial statements of the Barbados Conference Services Limited for the year ended March 31st, 2022, the non-reimbursable investment financing agreement GRT FM 19688BA, strengthening institutional and technical capacity for Barbados to meet the transparency requirements for the Paris Agreement with the Inter-American Development Bank. And then finally, the annual report of the operations of the Barbados Drug Service for the fiscal year April 1, 2018 to March 31st, 2019.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the Sorry, Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 45-2 and 22-1 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that standing orders 45-2 and 22-1 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it, those standing orders are accordingly so suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move the first reading of the following bills: the Supreme Court of Judicature Amendment Bill 2023 and the Integrity in Public Life Bill 2023. And that is, Mr. President, to beg that these two bills be read a first time.
The question is that those bills be mentioned be read the first time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it.
Obituary speeches.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to lead off on this matter. A few weeks ago, not so long ago actually, we gathered in the courtyard of this parliament to begin the process of viewing and saying goodbye to this nation's fourth Prime Minister. Shortly after that, 2 days later, we assembled and we joined the nation and, in fact, the rest of the region and those from even beyond the region to bid a final farewell to the man we called Prime Minister, but to whom others called Dad, for whom he was grandfather, and we saw the family together here in Parliament and at the burial service. I rise today, Mr. President, to offer a tribute to our nation's fourth Prime Minister, Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford. He is known as many things. Many call him Sandy, many call him Sir Lloyd, some called him Minister, others called him Deputy Prime Minister. He was Prime Minister, but to many, he was a servant leader to our nation at a time where we needed more of them. And if I could encapsulate what I'm going to talk about today in my tribute, it probably would, in a single sentence, it would be to say, Barbados in this time needs even more servant leaders. That's probably where I'm going to end up in my tribute. Barbados needs even more servant leaders in this time. Now, Mr. President, I remember in 1994, the 1994 election, I left Barbados at the time, and I went off to Mona, University of the West Indies, Mona campus, as an undergraduate student, having left the BCC on the eve of the 1994 election. My friend at BCC and now colleague in cabinet, Santia Bradshaw, our Deputy Prime Minister, determined she was not leaving. She was going to stay until the election was finished, and she had to vote for the first time in that 1994 election. But I watched it from afar. And I watched it from afar at the time, having had a bit of an evolution from that earlier view of a prime minister who had taken a decision at the time. The only thing that I, as a schoolgirl, knew about Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford was that he had cut public servant salaries by 8%. That was all I knew at the time. And I saw it through the lens of a schoolgirl whose mother was a public servant, and the conversations that were taking place in my own home and how I felt that affected me. Then I went into the BCC, and among the 3 A-levels that I did there, politics was one of them. And you know, over time, by the time I left BCC 2 years later and went off to Mona, that school girlish naivety that all that he had done was to cut my mother's salary had evolved significantly. And the first inclination of what a true servant leader looked like began to evolve in my mind as a university student. And that evolution evolved even further over time, because I went on then to be a student of international relations, including international politics, and I understood the complexities then as I studied international and regional organizations of what his decision-making may have looked like. But I saw it then only from an academic perspective. When I joined the Foreign Service in 1997, as a public servant then myself, I started to have an even further evolution in my thought process. And now standing here today, as a minister of government and a policymaker and a legislator in a government that has had to make very difficult decisions as a result of global challenges, my own perspective has come full circle, and I see what that schoolgirl naively thought was a simple decision to cut salaries by 8%, not being so simple even slightly. And many of the decisions that governments and policymakers have to take, sometimes you can take the popular choices. You can take the decisions that everybody sees through oftentimes very naive eyes. You think that it is just what you see in front of you, but you don't realize the complexities. And at the time, we had a leader who made a determination at his own expense that benefited our nation and in many ways still provides an important blueprint to the dynamism that is required of leadership. Leadership of a small island developing nation. Leadership of a country that is prone and highly vulnerable to external shocks. Leadership in a country that is still navigating the exigencies of policymaking in Bretton Woods institutions as they were at the time, the International Monetary Fund that he was trying to avoid. And who would imagine that in 2018, when we had to make decisions about government as an administration, and even all the times that have evolved since then, and we're still making those decisions, that Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, would have had to navigate many of those same decisions then at his time, in his time as Prime Minister. He was dealing with the changes in global trade. He was dealing with an IMF regime that was taking hold all across Europe in economies that was creating havoc. He was dealing at the time with the protection of the Barbados dollar and the potential devaluation of the Barbados dollar. He was dealing with a regional crisis that was of epic proportions that was seizing all the countries across the Eastern Caribbean. He, as far down as Guyana was having its own battles, and all through the Eastern Caribbean, we were seeing those challenges evolving, and he had to make a decision on what was going to be done in a Barbadian context to save the Barbados economy, to save the currency peg, which we accept is the holy grail, to also ensure that people were going to be in a position that they could live, even if they had to live on reduced incomes for a period of time. And he then made the ultimate sacrifice for which our nation benefited. And I remember being that university student at Mona, as I started to delve into what he had actually done that I disliked so much as a schoolgirl because of how I saw it impacting in my household, I remember saying in a class with colleagues who are still colleagues today, history will write kindly of him for the decisions that he made. And today, I could not have imagined that I would be standing in this position, delivering a tribute to him and recalling those words that history will write kindly of him. It is very easy when you're sitting on the outside of it and you see A plus B and you think it is equal to C, to think that all the government has to do is this, but what the government is doing is that, when in actual fact, the government has a whole alphabet soup that it is playing with, and it has to make critical decisions that are not always going to be popular. But it is his resoluteness, his commitment to his decision, and the fact that he knew that he had made the right decision, that I came to take a moment over the years to understand his impact. And it is there that I want to spend the bulk of my time. I recall being a student of the Barbados Community College, and he is widely credited for his investment and his foresight in the creation of the Barbados Community College. The Barbados Community College was, for me, perhaps I want to say, a watershed moment. I was that young girl who did not want to go to sixth form. I wanted to get out of school uniform. I wanted to get away from the rigors of school structures. I wanted to be in BCC. And so I hid my sixth form acceptance letter until I was sure I was into BCC. And off to BCC I went. And BCC was attractive to me, not just because I wasn't wearing the school uniform and I wasn't dealing with teachers in my business. It wasn't that. BCC became a bastion of education for history students who wanted to understand West Indian history. Trevor Marshall and the history room at the Barbados Community College was an attraction for me as a young girl. And off I went to BCC. And it was the experience of the BCC, that classroom, that began to expose me to the notion of government, not even my politics classroom so much. It was Trevor Marshall. It was the history room. And it was there that the concepts of social democracy and social justice that were so critical to Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford's philosophy of education, that I began to understand who he was and what philosophy meant to him, and how social democracy, a part of his philosophy, guided his policy on education. I was a beneficiary of that in the Barbados Community College as a consequence. But it also helped to shape my views, and I always would say to people, in a lot of ways, I'm a social democrat at times, where you know that in a country like Barbados, in a small country, there are those who have and those who do not. And government's responsibility is always to make sure that it takes the edge off of that potential conflict and make sure that there are services available to all Barbadians, whether they come from privilege or not. And so Sir Lloyd's commitment to education and to social democracy by ensuring that tertiary level education, the Barbados Community College, and free at that, was always a part of the landscape, was of significant benefit to Barbadians. And I wish to commend him posthumously for that commitment. In addition to that, Mr. President, I want to also speak very briefly about his commitment to education in another context. He was, as Prime Minister, the Prime Minister with responsibility for the CSME and was part of the process of developing the CSME. And we all recall the Grand Aunt's Declaration when that was signed, and the importance of the Grand Aunt's Declaration to institutions like the University of the West Indies. The University of the West Indies, of which he was a product, and for whom he became also an advocate. And if you look at the tribute that was paid by Sir Hilary Beckles, and I want to read a little bit, just very briefly, from Sir Hilary's comments on the passing of his tribute, on the passing of Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, you will understand what I'm referring to. Sir Hilary said, "From the beginning, Sir Lloyd, he threw his political weight behind the imperative of publicly funded education for the masses. This was a principle of his democracy and the vehicle on which he believed the nation would travel to economic prosperity and social stability. In this regard, he never failed to stand his ground in the pursuit of access to development for the historically disadvantaged and the necessity, and these were his words, to blunt the social sword of the traditionally privileged." These were the words used by Sir Hilary Beckles in his tribute to Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford. And he went on to say specifically about the University of the West Indies. He was an intellectual product of the UWI, and he was a contributor to the ideological vision of the UWI. He was, for example, adamant in his commitment to national independence and dignified nation building. This is particularly evident when he himself served in his own right as the support to the Right Excellent Errol Walton Barrow, and then subsequently when he became a minister from this place in the Senate himself. So, Mr. President, I think one of the things that caught my attention was his movement over time, not just starting out here in the Senate, but also into the roles that he played as a minister of government, in particular, his role as Minister of Education, and how those things were driven by a philosophy that was rooted in social democratic principles. On that basis, Mr. President, both the BCC and the University of the West Indies were beneficiaries of that ideological vision. And he sought at all times to ensure that they were a part of the development trajectory for Barbados. Mr. President, I want to spend a few moments also speaking about the role that he played when he came to office. His ascent came at the same time that there were others who were exiting. So he came to office in the tumultuous period in the post-war Caribbean, the history of the Caribbean, where in 1980 you had Walter Rodney in his descent, Maurice Bishop in Grenada in 1983, Forbes Burnham in Guyana in 1985, and then we had Errol Barrow in 1987. And it was during that period, in 1987, that we had the then Deputy PM coming into the role of Prime Minister of Barbados, and he held that role for over 17 years. There were a range of things happening when he came to office. For 7 years. I said 17. 7 years. For 7 years. For 7 years. There were a range of things that confronted his ideological visioning when he came to office. And I referred to some of them earlier. What was happening in global trade, internationally, poverty and marginalization taking place globally, but in particular in the region, economic reforms that were being undertaken, including those that specifically related to structural adjustment and the support that needed to come from international financial organizations. Now, Mr. President, who could imagine that those were the conversations that we were speaking about then, the structural imbalances in being able to secure financing for development for small economies. And in 2023, our own Prime Minister is still speaking to the international community about the importance of structural imbalances in contributing to the underdevelopment of small island developing states like ours and to the developing world. And that our current Prime Minister is speaking to the international financial organizations, in particular, those same Bretton Woods institutions, about the need for structural reform and the need to ensure that initiatives like the Bridgetown Initiative then once and for all treat to the important needs of small island developing states. These are issues that at the time of his ascent to the role of Prime Minister, Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford was treating to in his own way at a different time with different circumstances, but leading to the same results for the country. We then had in 1991, when he took up the responsibilities of Minister of Finance, a lot of the financial issues that were being dealt with. We have seen the currency peg for Barbados, and I called it the Holy Grail earlier, Mr. President. But why is that even a conversation? If you speak to most Barbadians now, most Barbadians will always draw reference when they talk about devaluation to Guyana and to Trinidad and to Jamaica. Each time they will make reference to what happened, in particular in Guyana and in Jamaica, in terms of devaluation. Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford became a friend of Guyana, and Guyana has, in many instances, spoken glowingly about the support that he gave to Guyana when they were, in their time, attempting to avoid structural readjustment, and sought to ensure that they were trying to be remaining out of the clutches of some of the Bretton Woods institutions. They may not have been terribly successful. The programs that were developed may not have worked in the way that they were intended, but they credit Sir Lloyd and his philosophy for supporting them in having homegrown solutions. Barbados in 2018 developed a homegrown solution. It worked. We developed a second incarnation of that homegrown solution. In each incarnation, Mr. President, Barbados has had the distinction of being blessed with leaders who, in times of crisis, make difficult decisions that, while they may not be popular with all, I am certain that there were those who, in the 8% period of the 8% cut, felt the same way I did. And there are those who, when there were cuts in the 2018 restructuring, didn't like the fact that they had to take a haircut either. They didn't like it. But in the interest of national development, we as a people have always historically made the sacrifice in the interest of national development. And we've always had the benefit of leaders, including Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, who then made sure that the decisions were being made. And I want to commend him again on this occasion, because we have seen how it has played out in a very different incarnation several years later with a structural adjustment program. We didn't have an 8% cut, but we did have a structural adjustment program and haircuts in subsequent years. We have, Mr. President, a CARICOM region that has a cabinet of prime ministers. Sir Lloyd was a valued member of the group of prime ministers. I'm told from preparing for this tribute today that those prime ministers at the time, when dealing with these global issues, even exchanged their drafts of their speeches and ensured that they were not each saying the same thing when they went into multilateral fora, and they helped each other in order to ensure that the Caribbean perspective was well received and that it was coherent across the region. There are those, Mr. President, who also speak about a lot of the work that was done in terms of the fiscal measures that were placed here in Barbados, but many did not always see the support that was done, that was given across the region. Mr. President, I want to close because I expect that today is going to be a full day of many of the colleagues giving speeches, and I don't want to hog all of the time, and I know that many people will say many of the things that I will say, but I want to have 3 remaining points that I want to emphasize here. As I stood on the gravesite, the burial site, last 2 Fridays ago, and I watched the family, I couldn't help, Mr. President, but think about how people who stand for public office and who serve in public office oftentimes have their humanity taken from them. I watched Garth, I watched Inga, I watched the grandchildren. And as I spoke to Sir Lloyd's daughter, Inga, afterwards, she said, I could see you drawing me in across the gravesite. Because as I saw her responding finally to the final burial rites being performed, I thought of many of the people who I have seen and known. This was the 2nd state funeral that I have attended. I did the same for Owenatha when he passed, Right Honourable Owenatha when he passed. And I remember the dignity of his family, Julie and Leah and his daughter Sabrina. I remember that day. And I think about our own journey as public officials. Sometimes we forget that families make the sacrifices to allow their loved ones to serve a nation. And if there was ever a personification of he who served a nation in the face of great vilification, and no doubt the family would have felt that, it would have been Sir Lloyd, especially in that period of the no confidence motion and the loss of that election thereafter. But his service to his nation and to his people stood him out in good stead. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact, and I want to use this occasion to call on Barbados. We have leaders who give of their time, day after day, who give of their service, who sacrifice, who stand on strong philosophical positions day in and day out in service of a nation. They are servant leaders. Yes, there are those that we will have challenges with. There's no doubt about that. But they stand in service to a nation. They step forward. They choose not to go into the private sector. They earn less in the public service. They give more in the public service. They sacrifice more in the public service. And it is a thankless job, except in instances like today, or at funerals where we then give people their flowers and we then recognize the service. But we make it almost a public sport of dehumanizing those who serve in public office. They're not real people. Their families are not really there. So their families, even if we are willing to vilify them, we don't see what we cause to their families who stand behind them when the doors are closed and the lights are off. And I want to take the opportunity to say that today, let today be an opportunity for us to see that sometimes popular decisions may not be always the best decisions, or unpopular decisions may not be the worst ones. But people who step forward to serve make the best decisions oftentimes with what is before them, with the information that is before them and with the circumstances that are before them. And we have to make sure that we step away from this practice of dehumanizing politicians because they step forward to serve. And Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford is the epitome of a historical servant leader. He took all of it on his back. His family, invisibly so, took it on them as well, because that was their father, that was their husband, that was their brother, that was their loved one, and they felt it in ways that we can never imagine or see. That is the one point that I want to make here. The second point that I want to make here is that for those who then choose to step forward to present themselves for leadership, everything will not always be and cannot be about popularity. Everything will not always be even internal to your own grouping. Internal to your own group, and we see it in a different incarnation playing out on many occasions. Everything will not always go the way you want it. And as a consequence, we have to always ensure that what we are doing is rooted in a philosophy that is about development, that is purpose-driven, and in the case of Sir Lloyd, it was about social democracy that puts people first. When we step forward to lead, if this is about self-elevation, if this is because we didn't get it one way and so we try to get it another way, if this is because, Mr. President, we feel as though we're entitled to something and so we must have it, and we try every way to make sure we have it, then you perhaps may not want to step forward and put yourself forward as a servant leader, because that was not what Sir Lloyd left as his legacy. Far from it. He stepped forward to lead for all. And he did so until the very end of his term in public office, Mr. President. The final point that I want to make is in communication. He was roundly criticized for perhaps not communicating enough, perhaps being too adamant, perhaps being too rigid. And there are those things which perhaps may be argued for a long time. Was he or was he not? We can't say. But what we do know is that the decisions that he made and he stood by, we can see in retrospect, were the right choices and they served our people well. Sometimes we have to be willing to stand up for what is the right thing. Sometimes we have to be willing to stand even in the face of opposition from others for what is the right thing. Not for the wrong thing and not for foolishness, but for what is the right thing. And I don't want to take away the responsibility that is the office of Prime Minister from sitting on a person's shoulders. If for each of these persons in here, all of us as senators, independent senators, government senators, ministers, and so on, we know what the weight of responsibility is as individuals. Could you imagine the weight of a prime ministerial office in a time of crisis? Sir Lloyd was that person who led in a time of crisis and who led his nation with great distinction. For that, Mr. President, I want to, again, on behalf of the government of Barbados, express our condolences to the family and the loved ones of Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, our appreciation and our sincere thanks for sharing him with us as a nation. On behalf of that schoolgirl in secondary school who initially thought the only thing that I wanted to see about him was a restoration of my mother's 8%, I want to be able to stand here today and say, I appreciate the decisions that he made and how he in turn then became that person who helped to evolve my vision of governance, government, and of leadership. And with these few words, I want to express my condolences to the family, to Lady Angelita Sandiford, to you, to Garth, to Inga. I know she has had to return with her family, but to the entire family circle of the Sandiford family. And with these few words, I want to read this resolution into the record and beg that it do now pass before I open the floor to the other tributes to come from the floor. Whereas the Right Honourable Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, KAJP, and one of His Majesty's Council, passed this life on the 26th of June, 2023. And whereas Sir Lloyd served as personal assistant to the then Prime Minister, the Right Excellent Errol Walton Barrow in the years 1966 to 67, as a member of the Honourable the Senate from 1967 to 71, and was a member of the Honourable the House from 1971 to 99. And whereas Sir Lloyd served as Minister of Education and Culture from 1965 to 1971, Minister of Education, Youth Affairs, Community Development and Sports from 1971 to 1975, Minister of Health from 1975 to 76, Deputy Prime Minister from 86 to 87, and as fourth Prime Minister of Barbados from 1987 to 94, during which latter period he held the portfolio of Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs, and finally, as this country's first resident ambassador to the People's Republic of China from 2010 to 2013. And whereas this former honourable member of Parliament and diplomat, the teacher, author, sometime poet, and sportsman, had a love and passion for education to his core, and his record as Minister of Education speaks eloquently for itself in the building of and expansion of a large number of secondary schools, the establishment of the Barbados Community College, a sixth form institution, and the Samuel Jackman Prescott Institute of Technology. His way of developing a nation of versatile and well-educated people. And whereas the dire and dark economic woes we experienced as a nation in the early 1990s were confronted by Sir Lloyd as Minister of Finance resolutely, with fortitude and a singleness of purpose, by rigidly advocating economic and social policies to restore the solvency of this country, that at times saw him despised and rejected, but out of which came the restoration and saw the birth and early development of the social partnership, a legacy of stability for his beloved country and an exemplar for the Caribbean in general. And whereas Sir Lloyd exuded a passion for regional and Caribbean integration and contributed with alacrity to and championed the advancement of the Grand Aunts Declaration and the work program for the integration movement, and further conceptualized the establishment of the Assembly of Caribbean Parliamentarians, which, though short-lived, is still a beacon for the region's integration. And whereas Sir Lloyd ensured that Barbados would rise to the occasion to allow Barbados to play its role in the fight to prepare the SIDS, Small Island Developing States, to prepare a more critical role in the fight to battle the existential crisis of climate by offering to host the first global conference on sustainable development of SIDS, which led to the Barbados Programme of Action on sustainable development of small island developing states. And whereas in this battle, he has left to guide our approach the ode to the environment, which was prescient in his analysis of what we face as planet and people. And whereas this distinguished and illustrious son of the soil, born of humble origins, was the epitome of amity, civility, humility, and integrity, the quintessence of the gentler and kinder Barbados he envisaged and advocated. Be it resolved that this Honourable the Senate pay the accolade of its highest tribute to the late Right Honourable Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford as an exemplar of dignity, courage, compassion, and humanity, and leadership by example, and share the sorrow felt by a grateful nation, and extend its deepest sympathies to his widow, Angelita Lady Sandiford, children Garth and Ninga, and to his other relatives, and express its wish that they be comforted by the memory of a life lived selflessly and in the service of his nation and people, dated this day of July 2023.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to pay tribute to Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, and I'm not going to go where most people have been from listening to a lot of what has been said. But I do want to start with this very simple request. I believe, Mr. President, that the time has come in Barbados where persons like Sir Lloyd and others who have had the privilege of being prime ministers of this country should always be referred to as Prime Minister. You go to the United States of America, George Bush will still be referred to as President Bush. President Nixon, same thing. And I believe it is incumbent upon us, if we begin to change how we view our leadership, that should be seriously considered, and with all of the privileges that go along with that, should also be extended to those persons whenever they leave office. The reason I say this, Mr. President, is that I've had the unfortunate privilege to watch persons who have served in that capacity struggle in this country at simple things, going to an event, or even going to a funeral of another member, and I've watched it, and I always felt that whenever I had the opportunity to speak about it, I'm going to speak about it, because those things are wrong. The former speaker spoke a lot about the sacrifices that these persons make and continue to make to ensure that wider Barbados benefits as much as humanly possible from their expertise, from the decisions that they make and such. The other thing that we need to do, Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, for persons, again, like Sir Lloyd, we have a museum on this compound. Young children from primary school coming right up should be able to go into those places, the museum, and to learn about the contributions of such people as Sir Lloyd. A lot of the things that we are hearing now were never taught to us when we were in school. And it's not just about Sir Lloyd himself, but about previous leaders also. A lot of it was never taught to us at school. We learned about King Harold and the War of the Roses, but we didn't learn anything about ourselves. And the contributions, if you continue in that way, then the sort of, I should say, and choose my words real carefully here, it's sort of things that you hear on radio programs and in the streets and in other things about persons involved in politics probably would change a little in some sense. One of the things that I admired most about Sir Lloyd was his resoluteness in terms of how he viewed things. I'll give you a classic example. As a Calypsonian, many leaders would have been fodder for the art form in terms of what was said. And I remember the first time I heard the song, "You Can Take It or You Can Lump It, None of You Ain't Breaking Up My Night Rest." Monumental words in terms of a song, but bravery beyond belief from the individual who spoke the words in the face of all sorts of criticism, all sorts of, and I use the word, betrayal, all sorts of things. And he made that point. And that stuck with me. Because the second thing that happened during that period that also stuck with me up until today is that a gentleman who shall remain nameless, but said these words also, that he felt that the Prime Minister at that time was an errant school teacher. I will never forget it. Had that gentleman be living in the territory from where he had come, he probably would not have said those words at all. Not out of any fear of reprisals or anything, but I believe that he would have had a different type of respect for the office that was held in his own country. And I say that to say this. Too often, as a nation, we begin to give accolades, and we begin to, as the young people will say now, give people their flowers after they have passed. And I will take the words from one of my own songs. How many more times will we see this play out? At some point in time, we have to look deep within ourselves and decide that there are some things that need to change. And I believe that that type of behavior, which we exhibit from one generation to the next, at some point in time, we have to confront it and to say to ourselves, this has to stop. And we must be able to reach out to people and to let them know that we appreciate the things that they have done. Or even to go even further, to use a word that will kill some people sometimes, to just say, to let people know that you love them. It's not that hard. But as I grow older, even in my own life, I understand that sometimes we miss these opportunities because we're so caught up in all the other things. It could be politics, it could be whatever of it. But at the end of the day, the point was made earlier, we have to remember that we're dealing with human beings, our brothers and sisters, regardless of if you agree, disagree, you know them personally or not. And everyone that has taken up that particular position, and I can say this, and I will speak from my own, again, point of view, has done and did what they believe would have been in the best interest of Barbados at that particular point in time. And for all of us on the outside who can have various different views, unless you are sitting in that hot seat, you can only speculate. You really don't know. And so it is important that when we come to these types of things, because there will be more of these tributes that will have to be paid. Let's not fool ourselves. But that we will be able to do it in an environment that is changed, a lot more appreciative of what these persons have done. Now, I spoke about my viewpoints in this area, but I want to talk a little bit about my interactions with Sir Lloyd. And I had to bring this with me today, and I'm gonna give everyone the opportunity to touch it because it's sacred, so to speak. I've had this since 1989, Mr. President, and you can look at it and you'll see it is in pristine condition. And this is a picture of myself and Sir Lloyd at 1988. The year is up. And me singing Family Ties in the Barbados Workers Union. And I was a young guy at that time. Yes. It tells you, I hanged on to this because Sir Lloyd was one of the first prime ministers that I can think of at that time who made his way into the Calypso things. Came out and was among the people. And he was so, I should say, elated. I mean, and even in the songs that were given him licks, he had a good time, enjoyed himself. And I found that to be, in my mind as a young person, then astonishing. That here it is that probably every 3 songs had something to say, Sandy this, Sandy that, something or the other. And he was there having a ball. And it stuck with me. Because the other thing that he did later on was to invite myself and a number of other artists to a lunch where he gave us, or he revealed to us, his plans to build a 2,000-seater auditorium at what we now call the LASC. And we were just, I guess the only word I could come with now is flabbergasted at the whole thing. That anyone would have the foresight for the arts in that way. Coming out of a society that has oftentimes neglected the arts and relegated arts and the artists to third, fourth, or fifth tier citizens, or whatever number you could find. He said, I remember it well, that he wanted to establish a national orchestra comprising of young people and adult players, and they would be housed at that particular venue so that persons would get the opportunity to enjoy classical music, to also promote our young people being able to write their own classical songs, and that calypsonians and other persons would have a home where they could perform, and it would be a home for the arts. And Mr. President, we were so blown away and so anxious to see this thing come to fruition that I have to say this here and now. That many of us, I mean, if we didn't have strong, as the old people would say, constitutions, like that, some of the fellas would die with heart attacks by now. When that particular plan was shelved for whatever reason, I don't know. And in its place, we see a wonderful car park that has absolutely no use. And these are the kinds of things that I'm sure Sir Lloyd, may rest in peace, probably would have been as disappointed as I am at not being able to have that particular project finished. And Mr. President, I stand here and I will tell you that that project would have changed the way how the arts would have been able to grow, how tourists coming to this country would have had a place to go of class where they can see local talent. There's so many things that could have been if that was only finished or saw right through to the end. And so I really wanted to set on the record that I could not thank him in more for just the idea alone of getting that done. Oftentimes, though, I wonder, and we always sometimes have to be able to put ourselves in other person's shoes. And I've wondered many times, like, how would it feel taking up the position of a prime minister at the time that he did, and under the circumstances that he did, coming after Right Excellent Earl Walton Barrow, national hero? There must have been huge way of expectation, because I know this society, I know it well, and it has a way, without any scientific measurements put to it, but it has a way of deciding in its own self who can and who cannot. It is one of the most dangerous things, I think just to use the word things, that we have as human beings, or as Barbadians in particular, that we do when we place people in boxes and want to decide who can or who cannot. And I know it well. I've lived it. I know it. And I'm sure that this is something that Sir Lloyd would have had to battle himself. It's never easy when you find yourself in that space between persons who may have done extremely well or are extremely popular, and you have to come after them. There's always that section of the society who will want to measure you without giving you a chance to do anything by what has gone before you. It is dangerous, but it is a reality that we face in this country and probably in other places, but I don't live in other places. I speak about where I live. But I know that it could not have been easy for the family, as was mentioned earlier, to deal with a lot of the things that were bantered about when you are in the positions. Because oftentimes, the public has a way of, if you're not careful, getting you to go and look into the mirror to ask yourself if this is the person who I am. And we can play games and we can pretend that these things don't happen. But I know that if you're on the ground and you keep your ears to the ground, probably every single person in this room, there will be something that someone, somewhere, will have to say about you. It don't necessarily gotta be true, but I can guarantee you that it ain't gonna be nothing good neither. Because that is how, for some unknown reason, we have been raised. Some unknown reason. But it is not for me to linger too long on those sorts of things. But I think it is important that while we look at Sir Lloyd's life and his contributions, that we also reflect, as was mentioned earlier by Senator Cummings, upon the damage that sometimes gossip and these things inflict on persons who don't deserve it. In particular, children, wives, and others like that. And so I would make the call for Barbadians to begin the process of choosing your words wisely when you speak things. Speak those things that are not only true, but good. And as the old people will always say, if you don't have anything good to say, keep quiet. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with it at all. Because sometimes it really looks hypocritical when we come to places like this, and then we have to say all of these nice things. But the times when we should say them, they are not said. They are not said. And so, Mr. President, like I said, I cherish this. But I don't cherish it more than the family. And so, with Garth being here with us, and I know he wouldn't remember me from school, because I think he and I probably would have gotten into a fight early. But, as little boys. But I seriously want to give you this because, luckily for me, I do things in twos, and I got another one. But I think this is a memory that I will have for a very long time. And like I said, he came into the tanks, he was humble. He was never a person that anyone you could hear say anything bad about, They never questioned his character or anything like that. You would always just hear people refer to the same old things, 8% cuts and whatever else. But there was never any conversations where anyone questioned his integrity, none of those things. And I think that when you have persons like that, popular or unpopular regardless, we should celebrate them to the highest levels. Because the world needs persons of integrity. It needs persons with good character in leadership positions all over the world, not just in Barbados, all over the world. And I think that Sir Lloyd was a shining example that all of us, any of us in here, if we're honest with ourselves, will want to emulate. So on behalf of myself and my own family, I send my condolences to your family. And Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to all senators, especially invited guests. I received with great sorrow the sad news of the passing of Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, our fourth Prime Minister. I first met Sir Lloyd when I was a postgraduate student at Cornell University, United States in 1968. Apparently, Sir Lloyd led a delegation of Barbadian educators to the United States, I assume examining education institutions there, and they came to Ithaca, where Cornell is located some 4 hours from New York City. And he asked, I understand, whether there were any Barbadians in the university. And it turned out at the time that I was the only Barbadian there who got a chance to meet Sir Lloyd and his delegation. And I remember very well that I took advantage of Sir Lloyd's visit to send a letter to Barbados to my mother. Those were the days when there was no internet and no email. And I wrote a personal note and asked Sir Lloyd whether this is something that he could do for me. And Sir Lloyd received the letter and personally delivered the letter to my mother at Charles Row Road in St. Michael. And my mother kept that letter for years. When she passed, among the documents that I was able to find was the letter that I had written to her when I was a student at Cornell. That memory was very important for me at the time because I did not have money to return to Barbados, fly home and fly back at the time, and I spent the 4 years at Cornell in a continuous way. I did not come home during the 4 years at all. Didn't have money to come back. I stayed there and eventually graduated with my doctorate degree. I did not meet Sir Lloyd after that meeting until in 2013, because I lived out of the country for a lot of time, until 2013 when I was nominated to be the second resident ambassador to the People's Republic of China in 2013. And I met Sir Lloyd at that time, and he provided a briefing for me about China, which served me well. In fact, in my book, copy of which I have with me today, called Memories of China, I wrote on page 16, the second part, quote, the second part of the briefings was a meeting with Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, Barbados' first resident ambassador to China, Sir Lloyd delineated the scope of his responsibilities as ambassador and the challenges which he faced. He emphasized the cultural differences between Barbados and China and the need to better understand these differences in order to have effective diplomatic relations. End of quote. I would say, Mr. President, that Sir Lloyd established the foundation of the positive, productive relationship that we have developed with China today. The role of an ambassador is not generally understood by all. Those of us who act in this capacity carry out a very important function of promoting a positive image for our country and seeking to define a way forward in terms of how the relationship can be productive for our country. Social and economic development is part of our agenda, in addition to good diplomatic relations. And China is special. As all would recognize, China has become a major world power today, the most populous country in the world and one of the richest. And the question is always raised, what kind of diplomatic relationships does a small country like Barbados, with 280,000 people, have with a country with 1.4 billion? What is the synergy? What is the dimension? What is the nexus? How do you define that relationship? And Sir Lloyd was able to help me transition from head of an international organization to being a diplomat in China. For that, I'm eternally grateful. But more than that, Sir Lloyd established in China a relationship with the ambassadors from the Caribbean, which we were able to foster and strengthen during my time there. We met on a monthly basis to discuss issues of Caribbean importance and to define a strategy for relating effectively in this large country. His work in China, as I said, established a platform of relationships, and I benefited from that sojourn there. I therefore take this opportunity, Mr. President, to express my condolences to his wife, to Garth, Inga, and the entire family. And Mr. President, may he rest in eternal peace.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Rappert. Senator Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to pay tribute to the late Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford as one who contributed significantly to the development of our nation. June 1st, 1987 is a day that should be etched in the memories of all Barbadians of a particular vintage. It's the day our national hero, the late Right Excellent Errol Walton Barrow died. It was also the day when Sir Lloyd took over the reins of this country. I always remember it as memorable to me because it was my first day at school in Barbados. I had just come up from St. Kitts, and it was my very first day at the Lodge School when the Right Excellent Errol Walton Barrow died. It was a turbulent time for us as a people. Sir Lloyd would have become our fourth Prime Minister in 3 years. The late Tom Adams would have died in 1985. The late Bernard St. John would have lost the election in 1986. The Right Excellent Earl of Walton would have died in 1987, and everything fell into the hands of Sir Lloyd. It was also a very turbulent time globally, as you would have heard from Senator Cummins. There were some troubling years as we go through economic cycles, as we've seen over time. There's nothing new about it. But I believe that God places the right people in the right places at the right time. And history has vindicated Sir Lloyd. History has proven that the decisions he made at that time were the correct ones. They were tough, they were harsh, but I believe time has served him well. He was prescient. As you heard from Senator King not long ago, a little detail that many of us would not have known, that he had a vision for the arts in this country. At a time when we thought that, as the Trinidadian Calypsonian Crow Weston Rollins would have said, we have a way of saying Calypsonians, they went to school, so everything they sing, we consider them as fools. Sir Lloyd saw beyond that. He saw the importance of the arts in development of the nation. And he was right. One of the richest persons in the world, an artist, is a little girl from Barbados. He saw the importance of it. But in those years, between 1991 and 1994 in particular, what they call the rough years, the turbulent years, the years of marching, the years of slurs, the years when people were feeling the pinch in their pockets. So Lloyd was looking even beyond this little rock into how we will interface with the world, how we should set ourselves up to deal with future challenges, as he saw that we would have future challenges. And so he formed what is now known as the Social Partnership, which is really an apolitical approach to nation building, something that will serve us well going forward in the future. But along with that, he was also audacious. He stood boldly to defend the economic stability and viability of our nation, this nation he loved, as you heard Senator Cummins said earlier. He's credited with standing up and fighting to save the dollar, the stability of the Barbadian dollar. You heard some of the quotes that were mentioned earlier. But he was also resilient. It was an era of name-calling, public shaming. Nothing was beyond public scrutiny. But he maintained his dignity. Long before Michelle Obama had said, when they go low, you go high, Sir Lloyd lived it. You cannot quote anything he said that was derogatory about another human being. He bore it all. Perhaps, as a man of faith, he often read Psalm 41, and particularly verse 9. Even my own familiar friends. some with whom I ate bread have turned their heel against me. He lived that too. And as you know, sir, I'm a connoisseur of calypso. I can quote a lot of them, but I will not tarnish this moment with some of what was said about him. But what I can remember is a song by Stetson Wilshire called Cricket Commentary. And I can remember the refrain of that song. It is only Sandy who batting steady. But look how he ran out of partners. He only had a few good tail enders. But it's Sandy batting with clout, because nobody could get Sandy out. He was strong. He was resilient. But what would have fueled his audacious nature? What would have fueled his resilience? What would have fueled his love for this country that he took, the type of blows that he took? And permit me just to repeat a story I believe I've told too many times, but I'll tell it again nonetheless. That story of the monk who was in a deserted monastery somewhere out in the desert. Many would go there to test their vocations, but leave after a short while. But this monk was there for years. And one day, a reporter went to interview him and asked him, "What has kept you here?" And in true monk form, he said, "I once had a dog. And one day, my dog saw a rabbit running out there in the fields. And he began to bark and he chased it. And then all the other dogs from the neighboring towns were barking and they followed. And they went over that hill. But then gradually all the other dogs started returning. But my dog never came back." And so the reporter asked, "So what's the point?" He said, "Only my dog saw the rabbit. Only my dog saw the rabbit. He knew what he was chasing." And I've highlighted that story where Sir Lloyd is concerned because in the context of Barbados, he saw the rabbit. He was right there in 1966 when this nation was just a fledgling. He would have watched, he would have prayed, he would have been there to nurture this young nation. When at that time many thought that things were going to go awry, many were uncertain about what Barbados would be, but he was there. And so he had a vested interest in seeing this nation develop to be the best it can possibly be. It was in his DNA. Perhaps like those words from Sir Cecil Spring Rice that are so popular. "I vow to thee, my country, all earthly things above." And in that stanza it says, it's a love that never falters, a love that pays the price, the love that makes undaunted the final sacrifice. He saw the rabbit. But it would be remiss of me if, in the midst of all these accolades for Sir Lloyd, I did not mention what was perhaps for him the most important one: his faith. His faith in God. Even in his public prayer, "Lord, help me to know my friends. My enemies I can deal with, but help me to know my friends." And the second stanza of that popular song, "I vow to thee, my country," speaks to faith. And it says, "And there's another country I've heard of long ago, most dear to them that love her, most dear to them that know." And at that time, sir, Cecil was speaking of the heavenly country, something for which our brother lived and yearned during his earthly sojourn here. He was a faithful member of the choir of St. Paul's Church, where he worshiped regularly. And as Senator King said, if you didn't know who he was, you wouldn't know who he was. He was there to serve his God. And that he did. And so perhaps, for those of us who've been given the opportunity to occupy these seats where perhaps persons of his ilk sat, it would be good for us to take some time out to recognize the obligation that has been placed upon us as we occupy this space. That we occupy the space where great men like Sir Lloyd once sat and guided the development of this nation. If I was in church, I would have quoted some words from a hymn from William Draper, but I'll just adapt them to speak to this space that we occupy. There's a hymn we sing for past worshipers, and it simply says, in our day of thanksgiving, one psalm let us offer for the saints who before us have found their reward. When the shadow of death fell upon them, we sorrowed, but now we rejoice that they rest in the Lord. And there's a particular stanza that says, these stones that have echoed their praises are holy, and there is the ground where their feet have once trod. Yet here they confessed they were strangers and pilgrims, while still they were seeking the city of God. These stones that have echoed their speeches are sacred. Let us ensure that though he may not be here physically, that we acknowledge and give thanks to God for the life, work, and witness of persons like Sir Lloyd who occupied these spaces, albeit for the fleeting moment which God offers us in this life. And so I'll end with a quote from an ancient sage around the 2nd century BC, Jesus ben Sirach, in that book, that apocryphal work called Ecclesiasticus. In chapter 44, in verse 1 and 14, he simply says, let us now sing the praises of famous people, our ancestors in their generations. Their bodies are buried in peace, but their name lives on generation after generation. May the name of Sir Lloyd live on in the nation-building process of Barbados for generation after generation. To you, Garth, Inga, and Lady Angelita, I take this opportunity to extend sincere condolences and pray that God will grant you strength as you continue to live your lives in the absence of our brother. But I also wish to extend sincere gratitude to you for affording him to give as much of his time as he did to our nation in helping us to be what we are today. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I should like to begin by offering my sincere condolences to the family of Sir Lloyd, Angelica, Sandiford, to you, his son, and his other son, and of course to his daughter, Inga, who I had the pleasure of working with her at my former workplace. And we had a really good relationship then, and I wish to extend every best wish to her. And the family as they go through this period of grieving. Mr. President, I remember remarking during the funeral to another senator, I believe it was, or a member of the House, that, you know, history will be very much kinder to Sir Lloyd than was the situation which he endured during his time in politics and as a leader of this country. And so it was interesting to hear the leader of government business in her remarks confessing, as it were, how her perspective had changed over time about the character, as it were, of Sir Lloyd, and how she had, as she had grown more experienced, she had come to recognize the importance. She had come to recognize the importance of the issues which he had faced during his time and how he had dealt with them, and the fact that he had remained steadfast and resolute and was not distracted by all that surrounded him, but his focus remained the people of Barbados, the economy of Barbados, and to ensure that Barbados, as far as he was able, would continue to grow and survive even in the harsh conditions of the day. And as I listened over the past weeks to the various tributes that would have been poured in to Sir Lloyd, I sensed that same level of kindness and so on, and that people had spoken about. And it wasn't not because, you know, as the old people say, you don't speak ill of the dead. But there was a certain genuineness I found of all of the contributions, whether it be from the government, whether it be from his own party, whether it be from detractors who were in his own party or otherwise. There seems to be this genuineness which suggests, and which I'm convinced, that now that the Barbadian community as a whole recognize what a good man, what an intelligent person he was, and the fact that without any flair, he was strong enough and he did what was necessary in the interests of his people. I don't have any very personal connections with former Prime Minister Sir Lloyd, except a very small connection in terms of the fact that I recall that when my wife was awarded an OAS scholarship to go off to Columbia University to do a master's degree, that she got a call from Sir Lloyd and his wife, who had heard, and they wanted to see her and to have a little chat with her. And the reason simply being that they had a family friend who lived in the US. And they wanted to give her that connection and introduce her to this good friend, so that when she had an opportunity and she wanted a break on weekends or at the end of the term, she had somewhere where she could go and feel comfortable. And that was as you listen to other people, you recognize that it was not only her, but other people to which they had done and extended that same level of kindness. And I think I don't want to obviously go back into all of the various good things which we have heard in terms of his outstanding contributions to education and so on. These have been now well articulated. But again, there's just one little thing which I would comment on. And again, it is a little sort of personal thing. I recall back in the 60s, the late 60s, when one of my sisters, who went to the St. Michael's Girls' School, as it was then, SMGS. And of course, we know they didn't have a sixth form. And they do now. Unfortunately, she was unable to gain a place. The other schools which had sixth forms at the time would tend to accommodate some of these pupils from the non-sixth form schools. She unfortunately did not make it into one of those schools. But it just happened that in, I believe it was 69, early 1969, it was announced that the community college would be open. And I remember how elated she was that she now had that opportunity to be able to go to the Barbados Community College and continue her education and to do her A-level studies, which she had been denied before because because there was no sixth form at her school. And so I think at that kind of personal level, we feel the contribution. My family and my parents have always insisted of the importance of education for people like us, whose only hope of getting ourselves out of the poverty trap in which existed at the time was to make sure that you got yourself a good education, and that would afford you a solid foundation on which you could advance in life. And so, to my mind, that is the real crux of what I would like to remember Sir Lloyd, along with obviously all his other things, but particularly that contribution in education. And as many people have said, he was a humble person, and he was able to communicate and to move around the ordinary people in the community with ease. I remember when he taught at when he taught at community college, and even after as Prime Minister, there was a particular shop in the back Ivy where the proprietress prepared hot lunches. And he was quite happy to go there on a regular basis, even as Prime Minister, and have his lunch. And, you know, those are perhaps not big issues, but it is those little things which when you remember, when you think about, you would see him as the great person that he was. And just to extend this commonality about, a little further, how much of us in here can remember that I believe a particular Barbadian beverage may have benefited because of, a slogan which was adopted by, certain people. We used to say Erskine, Sandyford, and Friends as we drank this beverage. And I am sure that the sales from that particular commodity would have soared because of that marketing which they got. And so I want to say how honored we as Barbadians are to have had Lloyd Erskine Sanford as a leader. You know, Mr. President, we can be proud of all of the leaders who have who took on the mantle of prime minister in this country. It is, and each one in their own way has brought their own characteristic and their own level of style of managing. And Lloyd Erskine Sanford sits equally, in my opinion, among all of those other prime ministers who have done so much and who have contributed so immensely to the development of this great country. And you know, as I was thinking about what I may say in these tributes, for some reason there was a poem which kept circulating in my head, written by Rudyard Kipling, the poem If, and I just, with your permission, Mr. President, just like to read it, because to me there are things which I see which so vividly reflects who and what Prime Minister Sanford was. And I'm sure that most of us in here will be familiar with this poem, but just to read it, sir. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubt too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting or being lied about, don't deal in lies or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you give your life to broken, and stoop and build up with worn out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss? If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there's nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither fools nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. And I think in a lot of these, what I've just heard reflects how Sir Lloyd lived his life. And I can, as I said at the beginning, I wish his family every good wish as they go through this period of grieving. And I trust that the soul of our departed Sir Lloyd will rest in peace and rise in glory. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Nurse. Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. I take this opportunity to really offer my sincere condolences through you, Mr. President, to the family of Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford. All I can offer are personal reflections as a person who did not know Sir Lloyd, but for whom Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford's work has been very important for my own development as a, as a political scientist. In the 1990s, I was a child. I did not quite understand everything that was happening, except to understand that it was a confusing time. There were many people who were not pleased with the situation. And this really is one of the things that encouraged me to study this period. And I did study this period as an undergraduate, as a postgraduate, and even when I did my PhD. So when I heard of Sir Lloyd's passing, I was very sad. And still am a bit, even as a person who has never met him. For me, Mr. President, looking at that time in Barbados and the region, it was very important for thinking about development. What road can a country take? Should a country take? The kinds of very difficult political, economic, and financial decisions that small island states are continually forced to make. And one of my pet areas to look at has been what was then the Protocol on Prices and Incomes Policy, which we now call the Social Partnership, and which we have looked at it as a model. We've spoken about it as something that is apolitical, it allows for a level of conciliation. But when we really explore the events that led up to the creation of this This was not, just an agreement that was made simply. This was something that was really birthed in conflict and has helped Barbados to navigate some difficult times by allowing different groups of people to discuss, sometimes not very easily, many of the things that happen in the country, the crises that we experience. And for me, I truly want to offer my appreciation to the family of Sir Lloyd for lending him to us. For lending him to us, as we have heard, there's not a lot more I can offer in terms of speaking of his contributions to this country. But for lending him to us at a time that was very difficult, for enduring many of the things we have heard spoken about today, and also to offer my appreciation for allowing persons like me who have an interest in politics to have, and we talk about ethics in research. So really when we are researching people and different entities, it is important to reach out to them and let them know about what it is you are doing. So offering persons like myself access to, and it might sound strange, but really interesting and important topics of study to think about development, in small island developing states, to think about economics as someone who looks at political economy, to think about politics in small states. And one of the colleagues in here, Senator Nurse mentioned that our prime ministers in Barbados have provided us with decent stewardship. And I can agree with that. And I can say that as someone who was able to study this time period and then study the years that came after, it really has been fascinating to look at the contribution of Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford and his government, as tumultuous as that time was, and I truly appreciate this opportunity that would not have been possible without Sir Lloyd. I also want to say that there's a little book that I often refer to, written by Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, Politics and Society in Barbados. It's a really simple book. It is one that I go to continually as just a reference piece. It is very easy to read for first-year students. For those who don't understand politics, it is really, for those who don't understand how politics works in Barbados, it is really accessible. And I always encourage people, when they don't understand, have a look at that book. I have it in my office. It's dog-eared. It has all kinds of markings in it. And it's not complex. And it is, again, one of these contributions that I find, as a political scientist, has been invaluable. It really has helped to break down a lot of the things that happen in Barbados for me. I think it has contributed to the understanding of politics for students in the area, at the University of the West Indies, at Barbados Community College, and perhaps those who are just lay students who want to understand a bit about what has happened over our political history in Barbados. There's not a lot more I can say, Mr. President, but again, to offer my appreciation to the family of Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, and to wish, to hope that he will rest in peace and rise in glory. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hanks. Senator Boyce, Kevin Boyce, that is.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will echo the sentiments expressed by my colleagues. Firstly, to express our formal condolences to the family of our late Prime Minister, Sir Lloyd. Sir, I wish to commence my contribution by indulging in a bit of recollection with regard to my understanding as to what occurred, not necessarily with any insight as to how it occurred. in what formed the imagery in my mind of this late Prime Minister. And I'll begin that perspective the years 93, 94, similarly to those expressed by other members of this House. At that time, sir, I'd returned from Trinidad where I had a sojourn, and you may not be aware of this, sir, but my father was involved in politics during this period. In the course of that involvement, sir,
I know that you're aware, but for the others who may not, I had the honor of being in this honorable place with your father. I sat here where Senator Cummings is, and he sat where Senator Hines was sitting down.
Well, I just wanted to share that fact in case it was unknown, sir. And during this period, Mr. President, I will try to put together let's say a mental jigsaw with regard to the image which I formed of the late Prime Minister. During this period, 93 to 94, sir, I do recall the public sentiment. I do recall being at the University of Waterford where I was attempting to find some form of knowledge and not doing too well in that regard, but the commentary at the time when I was attempting to learn, I do recall the marches both for and against. And I almost say it tongue-in-cheek, sir, that hearing the recent accolades and commentary, I can't imagine where those persons were found that took part in the marches from the positive sentiments which we now hear. But when I ask questions, so that was the picture I have in 93, 94, of those who would have known Sir Lloyd, they describe him as calm, quiet, but very strong. And I think that those are quite interesting characteristics of a politician who serves the West Indian populace, who I think we all can say quite emphatically like a little fire and oomph and boisterousness as they express themselves. So maybe that perhaps would describe where the anomaly that was our late Prime Minister started to define itself, and what was the difference? What was the difference which perhaps led to what we saw later on? Now, I did in my research find out that there was a nickname of Desert Boots from his time at Harrison College, and I believe that his son Garth would elucidate on that during the luncheon period. But I just want to make that name a reference in this house, sir, and I'm sure those who know will explain what it means, Desert Boots. Now, my interactions, there were 4 with the late Prime Minister or his surroundings. I do recall in the early campaign days of my father, who I just referenced, that I had an interaction with Sir Lloyd. He wasn't Sir Lloyd then, but he was just the Prime Minister, and he had come to speak at a campaign. I do recall meeting his daughter Inga, who I was thoroughly impressed by, and I do remember the SIDS conference at the BCC, that it was a big deal and there was a lot of excitement in the nation during this period with regard to it. So that's my first active memory. The second interaction with Sir Lloyd, and don't worry, I'm going to put all these pieces together, occurred when I was in Shanghai, and he was there as our ambassador to the People's Republic of China. And in true Barbadian fashion, we're all familiar that when you're presented to someone, they like to know who you are, where you come from. And what was interesting was that Sir Lloyd drew the connection not of my father to myself, but of my aunt, who was the PS in Trinidad of trade at the time. I don't know if that speaks to the lack of relationship or the fact that in true Barbadian nature, we will trace your origins back to whoever we recall closer. So that was a mere interaction. And when I met him in China, he seemed extremely comfortable. extremely wise, extremely content to show us and to tell us what was happening on the ground on how best to approach certain trade issues. I then recall seeing him at the funeral for the late Prime Minister, Right Honourable Owen Arthur, and I made it a point to go and shake his hand. I believe he was with his son Garth at the time, and he was, at that time, wheelchair bound. Then finally, I saw him at lunch with his family at a restaurant on the South Coast, being entertained and taken care of. And what I say and what I'm trying to do by references these personal, not fact, these personal observations, was that what I saw was a man at peace with himself and content. He really seemed content. He was surrounded by his loved ones. He was able to wax poetic and enjoy himself. And then, considering all that went before, perhaps it gives an understanding that all the difficulties which he would have endured politically, personally, with the loss of his daughter, as Seneca said, these difficulties strengthen the mind. Or as Confucius says, a man is perfected by the trials by which he faces. And in all that, I wish to end by saying that perhaps the most apt description of our late Prime Minister comes from himself. When, in doing the research for this speech, I came across part of the famous no confidence vote, a statement which he made, and which I would like to repeat and perhaps captures the essence of the gentleman, where he said, "I have always been, and no doubt will always be, a poor, civil, polite, humble, honest, and fair person, loyal to the laws of Barbados, and dedicated to the cause of the poor, the underprivileged, and disadvantaged in this country." These were his words, and I believe that this captures the essence of the gentleman. On behalf of my family, on behalf of a grateful nation, we thank him for his service, and with these words, sir, I am grateful to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Boyce. Senator Cummins. Her Honor, Senator Thompson.
Mr. President, I should like to convey my deepest and sincere condolences to Lady Angelita, her son Garth, her daughter Inga, and other members of the Sandiford family. The legacy of a leader is what we are writing today. We may not see it in that way, but really that is what we are doing, that we are writing the legacy of a leader. It is not an easy thing to do. And I find myself, Mr. President, in a very interesting place. My views of Prime Minister Sandiford evolved in many ways over the course of the time that I knew him. I knew him first as a father, picking his daughter up from school, his daughter Sherry Ann. I knew him as a father who I wrote to a condolence letter when she died in shocking circumstances for those of us who would have known her and gone to school with her, I felt what had to be the agony of parents suffering what must be the worst possible pain a parent can endure, seeing your child die before you, and in circumstances where she was young, had her life ahead of her, and where her death was so sudden that I could only have imagined how difficult it must have been for her parents and for their family to try to reconcile themselves to words that were being uttered to them. I knew Prime Minister Sandiford as a son. I served with him in the lower house, in the other place, sir, when that chamber paid tribute to his mother. At that time, I did not appreciate what I would come to understand and to feel when he gave his thank you remarks. But I did later, because I saw the same thing in my own life. On that day, when the house paid tribute to Mrs. Sandiford, he rose gracious as he always was. And that was one of the hallmarks of his leadership, that even when he was under the most acute attack, he maintained an equanimity and a grace that was unbelievable. And I say my feelings evolved because I started by being completely neutral and indifferent, and perhaps somewhat hostile to this man. And that's the truth, because there were, if you came through the politics at that period, that was the undercurrent in the country. It was the prevailing sentiment. But on that day, he thanked the chamber for paying tribute to his mother. And he said that as a child, his agony was to feel her own, unable to get around as she was, immobile, but sitting in her bed every day, listening to the calling programs, to the casual cruelties, my language, not his. But I understood later on that that is what it was. The casual cruelties that are uttered by people with such an amazing sense of authority and knowledge, speaking about what they do not know and do not understand and really don't care to be fully informed about. And he talked about how difficult it was for her and how powerless he was to stop her pain. And I understood it when I saw my own mother in exactly the same place. And it made me recognize that truly those who come to politics with a heart of service, that they and their families endure much, and that we really do not pay them for what they suffer or what they give. And we do not give them the due that they deserve. I knew Erskine Sandiford as the catalyst for which I came to politics, because I was so annoyed with what transpired during his term in office. And I did say that the undercurrent at that time was hostility. I was so annoyed at what people suffered and endured that when I was asked by Henry Ford to offer myself to Henry, no, I thought about it and initially said no, and then I determined that we had to see a change in the socio-economic fortunes of the country, and that yes, I would serve. I was young, I had no children, I figured that I could make a contribution, and because of what I saw, I wanted to. I came then to see Erskine Sandiford, and I say Erskine Sandiford not out of any disrespect, but certainly that is what we called him at the time. He had not yet been knighted, as a keen debater. But before that, before I even got to see him as a debater, I was present, Mr. President, in the lower chamber at the invitation of Owen Arthur, as he then was leader of the opposition, to witness the no confidence motion, which became the lever by which the government of the day was removed. For those who were not present, history will record the words on what took place. History cannot record the emotionally charged moments in that debate. Prime Minister Sandiford looked wounded, and I imagine that he must have been, because his team, his side, really had turned on him, and he clearly had not been anticipating what was going to happen that day. And speech after speech on both sides. I mean, it was as if a dagger was drawn and people were using it. And he sat there, serious, but accepting as a politician of what he knew was coming by the time he saw the speeches. And the opposition, as it then was, knew. And there are moments in politics, I say this particularly to our side. This is not the time to talk about some of the other moments in politics. There's a moment in politics when you wound the leader and you know that there's no coming back for the political party. I saw that happen to the Barbados Labour Party in that same lower chamber. Today is not the day to talk about it. But it is interesting that the person who wielded the knife on that occasion in the future was sitting in the chamber at the time, witnessing, was present, was not present. But the history repeated itself in the same kind of action. One after the other, it was clear that by the end of that debate, a government was going to be in crisis, and a decision would have to be made as to how it would play out. And as there was a sense of almost fear in the room because you didn't know what was going to happen. It was on a nice edge. You didn't know which way it was going to go. You didn't know what was going to happen. In the end, the Barbados Labour Party did not have the numbers for the no confidence motion to be carried, but the government was fatally wounded, and we knew it. And as people left the chamber that day, I remember Wes Hall paused to have a conversation with me, and we held hands and prayed, standing on the floor in the other place. And the news that followed was that clearly the government was in crisis, but it was there that we saw a prime minister in his lowest personal moment rise into the office of leadership in relation to how he would deal with what had transpired. He could have chosen several different routes. He could have chosen to try to reshuffle the cabinet at that point. He could have opted for many of the things that a prime minister would have used in his toolkit. Prime Minister Sandiford chose the democratic route. He said, we are going to an election. If y'all are not happy, and if this is where we are, let the people make a decision about what they want. And history will speak about it. We know what the historic result was. The government changed in the September of that year when the election was called. And I then saw Erskine Sandiford across the floor. I was curious about this man. He was a subdued but brilliant debater, lethal with his knowledge, his vocabulary, his garnering of facts and issues and undercutting you. We had an argument over Shakespeare one day. I quoted Shakespeare. He told me I was wrong. I told him he was wrong. We argued about it. I won't say who was. He was very effective on the floor. But he taught us many lessons, and I say us, because you have to remember that in that 94 Parliament, you had then sitting Raul Eastman. Sir, you will forgive me, but the record needs to have some of the names. So I know that I'm breaching the rule. You had Raul Eastman, you had Ronald Toppin, you would have had Mia Motley, you would have had young people who would then carry the country for the next 15, 20 years. So there was a historic sense then in the context of the role that Erskine Sandiford was playing. Because what he was doing then, two things. He was serving, and I'll come to this in more detail in a couple of minutes, sir, as the bridge generation. The bridge generation between those born pre-independence, whose time in leadership was coming to an end. And he was serving, therefore, with the post-independence and the independence and post-independence MPs who were then coming to a different perception of leadership and the place in the national polity. So on the one hand, there was the Branford Tates, representing a particular era. And then on the other hand, you had people like Mia Motley and I say Mia Motley because of course we were both then just MPs. In the Parliament at that time was also Bree St. John. And therefore, those of us who were sitting had the opportunity to hear the perspectives of a DLP leader and a DLP that had come through the pre-independence period and served under Errol Barrow, and were now ourselves as post-independence babies coming into our own as national leaders. It was really very exciting because when the debate started, we had to sit down, shut our mouths and learn. Big men were talking about things that they had experienced of which we knew nothing. These were the independence warriors who had transformed the nation with a vision. I mean, poor black people's children who had transformed the nation Barbados from being a small island developing state with an uncertain future to a country that would then come to be known as punching above its weight. Here was the man who was leading, or who had led the transformation in education, who had led the work in health. And it was interesting that Billy Miller, who was the health minister, who would have developed all of the polyclinics and then the work that Branford Tate did thereafter with tertiary health care, all kinds of sophisticated heart treatment and investigative diagnostic capabilities. So you can see almost how the country was being formed and the socioeconomic parameters that shaped and molded us. All of the giants were sitting there at the tables. And it was amazing because the level of intellectual engagement beyond the political divide, and even because of the political divide was a heady experience for young politicians. So that Mr. President, Prime Minister Motley I say that because I'm trying to root generations and for you to see this speech in a generational context as well. We had the opportunity to serve with Bree St. John in a parliament with Bree St. John, in a parliament with Erskine Sandiford, in a parliament in which she would become Prime Minister, in a parliament with which David Thompson would become Prime Minister, in a parliament in which Owen Arthur was Prime Minister. 5 Prime Ministers across the tables, across the divide, across the floor. None of them intellectual. And Frondell Stewart, 6 Prime Ministers. None of them intellectual slouches. So that when ideas started to contend about how we craft a nation, what are the important socio-economic imperatives, how one constructs a development paradigm that is sustainable, it engaged you as a policymaker and as a young person and as a minister of government. So that period, that last period in which Erskine Sandiford served in the parliament was pivotal in our history. Because remember, we've gone beyond the 8% cut. No, we're in a completely different period. The country is going through a period of rebuilding and restructuring and revisioning how it is going to position itself to go forward. But let us understand that the work that he did in education was critical because at that time, the government of the day, this is a small island developing state that isn't expected to do particularly well. No natural resources, no large economy, no major exports beyond sugar, and the days of sugar are limited, etc. So his role and that of Prime Minister Barrow was to construct institutions on which its country could be built, on which an economy could be anchored, on which a society could be stabilized. But the most critical function that they performed at that time, sir, was allowing Barbadians to see a vision of themselves as capable of building the country. That is really what it was. That coming out of post-colonial society, the greatest definition that we had to do was the definition of ourselves as a people, and to know what we were capable of. And in building an educational system and institutions to educate a country that was poor, black, barefoot, and uneducated. I mean, that is the reality. This is colonial Barbados you're talking about. I mean, my father's a businessman, couldn't get a loan in Bridgetown. He was told, we can't lend you so money. To do what? Business? What do you know about business? Come on. So the role of how they were building the country, defining the country, and saying to people, come on, people, we can do this. This is when Barbados was defined. And he was central to that national definition. People talk all the time about Errol Barrow, but they don't talk about the work that his cabinet would have done in building the country and defining who we are as a people in that critical period. Because it wasn't during the colonial period that we got to know ourselves. It was in this period that we got to define and understand who we really are. The other important thing which Erskine Sandiford did at that time, and as I indicated, no disrespect, was to hold the Democratic Labour Party together. We saw later on, fighting break out after he left in the Democratic Labour Party. We have seen fighting within the Barbados Labour Party in a period between leaders or a fight over leaders. This is common in political parties, that there are fights over leadership and people getting their hands on the reins of leadership, on political office, on power, on who is going to emerge as prime minister. And very often, political parties do not do proper succession planning. And when the maximum leaders walk away or die, the parties tend to crumble. So Erskine Sandiford had a critical role to play in holding, and when you look at what is happening to the Democratic Labour Party today, you got to feel all the more grateful to him. He had a critical role to play in holding the Democratic Labour Party defeated at the polls. And the BLP, strong, triumphant, young members, fresh, exciting, articulate speakers. I mean, the BLP had excellent debaters in those days. And because we were young, we also excited the country in a different way. And it was important, if you look at the historical steps, that the Labour Party should have come to office at that time because of the kind of symbols that the country needed to carry itself for the next period. So here was Erskine Sandiford trying to deal with succession planning, allowing David Thompson to find himself and his space and his voice as a politician and as a leader himself, allowing the Democratic Labour Party to deal with the pains of defeat and the questioning of why we lost and should we have lost and how we deal with loss and how we build back ourselves after loss. And there he was, just as he had held the country steady, holding the Democratic Labour Party steady in its journey away from the defeat of 1994. So he became, as I said, a bridge prime minister, or a bridge leader, or bridge politician. I say leader not because he was the named leader, but because he, as one of the senior statespersons in the country and as one of the elders in the Democratic Labour Party, was playing a cementing role in the party at that time. And then, sir, we recognize that here was a person born around the time of the riots, having to deal with a vision of a new Barbados and its a reflection of itself in the mirror of history. Here was a person who had seen urban and rural poverty in that colonial period when, sir, persons who grow up in houses these days where everybody in their house, even when they describe themselves as poor, have their own personal device and their own personal TV and so on, cannot remember what it was like when there was little electrification in the country, and that you knew who in the community had a TV because you could see the blue glow through the window. And you could tell because when you walked down the street, several people from the community were assembled outside of that window watching the TV, the only TV in the community. And when the people wanted to go to bed, or if they got vexed, or if they just felt like showing off, this TV is mine, they would get up and close their windows. And you would have, in the middle of your TV program, which was about to come to a very exciting end, you would have to walk away and speculate about what happened, or ask somebody who lived in the community some distance away what happened if they managed to see the end of a program. So you are talking about a man who saw a very different Barbados from the one in which we live, but who helped to construct it. And if you understand the historical passage, sir, then you could see why he could come to the point where no matter what He was determined to maintain the parity of the dollar. Now, we can debate as to whether we should have got there at all or not, but that is another argument for another day. The point is that he did everything that was necessary at that time and took the hard decisions that had to be taken to save the dollar and the country, because it wasn't just the dollar. It was referred to in here today as the Holy Grail. And the reality is that in Barbados, the parity of our dollar is caught up with our self-respect as a nation and how we see the country and how we see our position in the rest of the Caribbean and the world. And Sandyford understood that and knew that if the dollar fell at all, that with it, the country's perception of itself would also be adversely impacted, and he knew what he had to fight to defend. And I can only imagine having known what it was like myself to have a no confidence motion brought against me, having known what it is to have people calling programs going on all the time, having known what it is. And I'm not equating my experience with his. I'm simply saying that as a politician, you get at a point to have greater empathy and to better understand what the leader and what other politicians go through, and know what it is to go into your bed and turn and watch the sun rise because of a decision that has been made or is about to be made, or the potential of a decision, the potential impact of a decision that is to be made. I wonder, sir, in an atmosphere where every decision now, people tell you, you have to ask the population how they feel about it. If Sandyford had to ask the population at the time, do you think the dollar would have been saved? With the number of options that would have emerged, the quarreling and the carrying on, it would have been very difficult for him to get to the point where he could take a decision. So in the time remaining to me, thank you for signaling, Mr. President. I should have kept my back turned because there are a couple more points I want to make. I think, too, that we have to, in talking about legacy, commend Sandyford, the visionary. The social partnership has been an instrument of social cohesion. It really has. It is much lauded and respected and admired and now emulated outside of Barbados. At the time it was set up, people were savets over the 8%. I was part of those people who were marching up and down the country and so on. At the time, I don't think that anybody really contemplated what it could do for Barbados, that all of your stakeholders and all of your social partners are coming together to discuss, address, and come to common ground on the controversial issues, on policy issues, on the macroeconomic framework, on the position of labor, on where employers will stand. These are issues which cause serious social fracture, political upheaval, and serious divide in countries. But because of this architecture which Erskine Sandyford put in place, this country, a little small island developing state, is able to bring its stakeholders to the table and discuss and address in a mature, responsible way issues of importance to all interest groups in the country. I commend him for his work as an environmentalist and his bringing of the first International Conference on the Sustainability of Small Island Developing States to Barbados in 1994. Again, in this matter, he was visionary. We did not appreciate at all the import of having the Barbados Program of Action as a platform, a global platform for the development of small island developing states, recognized within the multilateral system and used as a yardstick for accessing development aid. In fact, the Barbados Program of Action identified climate change and energy as development issues long before they were recognized within the UN system as major development issues. So once again, that is another element of visionary leadership that he brought. My final 2 points, Mr. President, if you will allow me, are in the 2 minutes I have left, sir, are to commend him as a political strategist. We do not think of Erskine Sandiford because he was always so quiet. You know, he was not one of the loud ones and so, as a political strategist, but Sandiford was. The very fact that he emerged as Prime Minister when there were other contenders, a principal among them, sir, the daughter of whom sits here. I mean, people would have thought that Bradford Tate would have been one of the natural successors to Errol Barrow. And there were other contenders at the time. I don't have the time to develop the politics around it. But it is part of what has to be analyzed in the history. And when you look at the legacy of Sandiford, the fact that he emerged really says that he was a tremendous political strategist. I already spoke about his role in dealing with succession issues in the Democratic Labour Party. His naming of the ABC Highway was a particularly shrewd political shot, because as you know, this was the Tom Adams vision, and then there was a question of how it would be named, and Sandiford maneuvered so that Adams got peace, Barra get peace, and the pulling Cummins through, and nobody could quarrel. It was a master political stroke. Then there was the timing of the 91 campaign. We are in a period now where we have a parliamentary reform commission, and there are issues as to whether prime ministers should be allowed to determine what date an election can be, or whether we should have fixed terms. Sandiford in the Westminster system had the power to determine when the election would be called, and he called it at a time when the BLP was not ready for the election, and he won in January, I think it was, of 1991. That was the first election that both Prime Minister Motley and I ran in as candidates. We both lost. She came into the Senate, but we both continued to plow the political fields in our respective constituencies, and we would be rewarded with being voted in as parliamentarians in 1994. He was finally, sir, a statesman. He was, and we saw it repeatedly when he asked, how did we get here, of his own political party, because he knew what he had suffered to save the country, and he dared to ask the question in public, how did we get here, when he challenged the state of the economy. And there are other examples that I could give, but I would close, sir, then on 1.5 points. The half point is to pick up from Senator King. The Parliamentary Reform Commission is sitting, and I think you raised a valid question. The last time I saw Prime Minister Sandiford was at Don Blackman's funeral, but I saw him when he was still very mobile at the airport a day. Security guards were treating him rough. He was trying to find some parking space. I went to him, I said, Prime Minister Sandiford, may I help you? And he told me what he wanted, and I said, I'm sorry about this, and I tried to help him and so on. We must evolve a practice and a concretized policy for how we treat former political leaders and prime ministers. I I don't care what party they belong to. If they have served, then they must be treated with a certain dignity. They should have at least a car and driver. They should not be butting about looking for some place to park and some long little security guard that can't recognize. Look at the government out here tell me name one Sandyford. This kind of nonsense, it should not happen. They should have a special number plate and so on. And I'm asking the country really to let us be mature enough to deal with this matter properly. I close, sir, with the question that I've asked myself in reviewing the legacy of Lloyd Erskine Sandiford. What does it mean to serve? What does it mean to serve your country? What does it mean to put your country first despite pain and loneliness and misunderstanding and misrepresentation? That answer resides in the character and the service of Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, and I commend him to Almighty God and all the angels.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor, Senator Thompson. Senator Tate. Senator Tate will make her presentation from a seated position. We've already discussed that, and please understand she is not in breach of any rules or conventions because of medical situation. And Senator Monique Tate.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for accommodating me. I hope it is not a permanent state of affairs. I am sorry that Garth is behind me, but consider that I am talking to you while I speak, because unlike most, if not all, of the tributes, with the exception of the Deputy Prime Minister, my angle is going to be as a child of a politician. So, say again, Mr. President? Oh, bring it closer, okay. So I am happy to be able to pay tribute to the late Right Honourable Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, Knight of St. Andrew of Barbados and JP. That's who he was for most people. Over the last few weeks, we have heard that he was many things to many people. He was a statesman, he was a prolific writer, he was a leader, he was the Prime Minister, he was a personal assistant, he was a senator. He was a devoted husband. He was a great father. He was an awesome grandfather. For me, he was Uncle Erskine. And that is where my tribute will be, Mr. President, because that's who he was to me, and my older sibling, Sister Sharon, and my younger sibling, Bramford. There's a saying by the American writer Brandon Sanderson which says, "Act with honor, and honor will aid you." Well, this maxim seems very fitting for Sir Lloyd, because in the last few weeks, whatever is that happened when people went marching sometime in the 90s, quarreling about some kind of cut of salaries, seems to be obliterated, because he has been vindicated. We had a full confessional in the other place. Everybody got up and talked about they were confessing. And it was frankly refreshing. I hope that he was able to benefit from some of the vindication while he was alive, but certainly while he may no longer be with us. If Garth and Inga are anything like me and my siblings, to hear your father's name be cleared finally is a good thing, because as others would have alluded to, you attack my dad, you attacking me. You cuss my dad, you cussing me. The thing about Uncle Erskine, though, I have no memory of him even raising his voice. Monique, how are you? Are you learning at school? How was your department? This was what it was. The house was a Garden of Eden full of fruit. We played. We, and I'm going to say, those who serve with honor, like those who are children of persons who serve with honor, Mr. President, the Sandiford children, the Tate children, the Graves children. We grew up with men and women, or to us, mothers and fathers, who believed that we were to be raised with God very much in our focus, and we were to be raised in humility. Arrogance was not something that was tolerated, or even, I don't recall seeing arrogance in our way of life. Constituents came first. That was understood. It wasn't something that was a problem. That's just our way of life. And when you had parents that looked after you, tried to shield you from the evil, for lack of a better word, that's not what the word I want to use. They wanted to shield you from the politics. Yes, that's a good word. Tumultuousness. So that's who our parents were. That's the environment that I was accustomed to, being in the presence of both Uncle Erskine and Auntie Angelita. The focus was on ensuring that we had as normal a life as possible. So it wasn't a surprise to hear Inga and Garth in that interview with CBC that their dad made sure to come home for dinner. That may not seem like a big thing to some people, but that was major when you had a father who was a busy and popular politician. That was a father making the sacrifice to ensure that you had a normal life, or as normal a life as possible. Christmas for us was whenever Daddy finished touring every floor of the hospital. It's all right. You just know you got to wait. You can't be hungry. Wait. He had things to do. And I believe it would have been a similar type thing for the Sandiford children. Uncle Erskine was a kind man. He was a quiet man, but he was not a foolish man. When I was coming here this morning, I heard Senator Cummins make a reference to the statement of Sir Hilary Beckles. And I too came across that statement on the passing of what is being referred to as a Caribbean political stalwart. And one of the things that Sir Hilary said about Sir Lloyd, that as a political stalwart, Sir Lloyd was, I think this is just beautiful, was generally unhurried and often unshakable in his approach to devices phenomena. That is exactly who Uncle Erskine was. And what I like about the tributes is that there's a common thread where everyone says he was a gentleman. He was also a gentle man. There is also another statement that Sir Hilary made, and he said, in reference to Uncle Erskine's service to country, he said in that same speech, or in that same statement, it was this sense of service to the nation that contributed significantly to its freedom from International Monetary Fund enchainment. When you think on that, one could argue that Sir Erskine was before his time. And he was in a world when politics was not as guttural as it seems to be becoming. I believe that as children of politicians And I believe that the Deputy Prime Minister encapsulated it very well, where people don't take into account how their actions affect family members. I said earlier that our parents went out of their way to protect us from the political arena. But it could be that they didn't do such a good job because you don't see a single one of us engaged in elective politics. So we know what it's like. And so that is why I can join with Sandiford children and other children of politicians and smile when our parents are complimented for the service, because we know the sacrifice and we know the effect it had on them as individuals, on their relationships with their respective spouses, be it husband or wife, and on us. For me, I remember spending time playing. That's what it was. As I got older and he saw me, I always felt like I needed to get to attention or courtesy because I wanted to be on my best behavior. I wanted to have the best deportment because I wanted him to be proud of me and I wanted him to see me and say, "You're doing a good job." But as I was talking to my sister recently, there is a time in our lives where Erskine Sandiford became a giant of a man for my family. On October the 4th, sorry, beg your pardon, on August the 4th, 1990, my mother died suddenly, unexpectedly, and she wasn't even sick. Do you understand? It was probably some of the darkest days of our lives. I lost hair, my sister went gray. It was not a joke. It wasn't a joke, it was very real. And that was after she had been, what led to her death, leading up to that, she would have been hospitalized, and that was all public, and anyway. She dies, and we are bereft with grief. There are three of us. We are young people. We're young adults. And poor daddy has to look after his now little children. Because this young adult thing, mommy gone, it's not making any sense. So we had lost our mom. Dad had lost his partner and love of his life. And he was doing his best with us, but you know what was absolutely amazing? Dad had the support of Uncle Erskine, Uncle Philip, known as Sir Philip Graves, Uncle Morris, known as Sir Morris King. Uncle Erskine, the Prime Minister of Barbados, was one of the people who went to the tarmac when my mother was coming off in a casket off of British Airways and coming down the conveyor belt in a casket. He was there next to Daddy. He helped with Mommy's service. And he became beyond a colleague. He became like a brother. So you know when you lose someone and everybody's there for you and he's there for you, and they're there for you right up to the point of the service. And then life continues after that. And you don't really expect people to still be there. They've done what they are reasonably expected to do. That's fine. But there is life after this funeral. Uncle Erskine used to check on Daddy, and check on Daddy, and check on Daddy. Now, I didn't know this because I cute and I'm the young one, all like Garth and Sharon, old, so I would have learned it after the fact. Not old as in old, older. Yeah. He checked on Daddy. Daddy then had that support that allowed him to have support. That's who I know Erskine Sandiford was Sir Lloyd. That's who I remember. And that is, to my mind, a summation of who he was. You know how he was, Mr. President, too? By the way he used to speak, his demeanor. There was always like a peaceful spiritedness around him. And it was also reflected in things like the hymns he chose for his service. The hymns he chose for his service was very telling and showed you the measure of the man. I'm glad he was a part of my journey. I believe my life was enhanced because of Uncle Erskine. He was a good person. He was a gentle soul. He ensured that you stayed focused on doing what was right. He was very sure that you should be educated and benefit from the top tier education we have in Barbados. And we have to give him the credit for that. But his example of, as a family man, was second to none. It was real. And he genuinely was interested in you if you were having a conversation with him. I'm not surprised about what Senator King spoke about, because that epitomizes, that personifies who he was. And you can tell then that he was genuine, because it can't be everybody saying the same thing unless it's true. He had a genuine spirit. He will be missed. He will be missed. This humble, kind man who was centered in Christ, who happened to have been the 4th Prime Minister of Barbados, a dedicated educator, and a formidable political persona. I'm thankful to him for the impact that he had in our families' lives. And Mr. President, as I close, I have no doubt that he's going to rest in peace and absolutely rise in glory if he hasn't done it already. The line is on in heaven. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Senator Miller.
Thank you, Mr. President. I remember Sir Lloyd and the date I met him. It was the 9th of December 2003. I remember it well because this man that I regarded as a political giant. And this man, when I met him, finally, was probably one of the most humble people that I ever met. The circumstances under which I met him, one would have expected him to demand to be pushed ahead, but he didn't. And we managed to speak in a private conversation. I consider that a privilege. So what we spoke of, most of it cannot be repeated. But within that conversation, I realized that he was a man of tremendous integrity, and that he honestly felt, and I see it reflected in the words of Sam Cooke, that change was going to come. And I felt that when, in the 90s, the harsh decision had to be made about 8%, he understood that change was going to come and that it was going to bear fruit. But I think it is important, Mr. President, to realize that his dedication to promoting education and supporting the drive to educate, if possibly all Barbadians, is very important. And that type of legacy, Mr. President, needs to continue. So we should not find that 40 years on that we have a literacy rate, Mr. President, that falls far below par, and that what we took for granted in terms of tertiary education and secondary education of our people has been forgotten, and we return to where we used to be. I thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move that this resolution now be passed, be approved.
Let me associate myself with the remarks of the Honourable the Senate as we pay tribute to someone who has sat in this place and done so with distinction. And I note the reference to one of my favorite hymns, and I've given instruction that be one of the hymns at my eventual passing. In this day of thanksgiving, one sound let us offer for those who before us have found their reward. And these stones, in this case, these seats that they have sat on are holy. So really it is part of the continuum of leadership and development, our contribution to society. And of the Right Honourable Sir Lloyd Sandiford, I can say that he truly, as referenced by Senator Maynard, believed that change was going to come, but he was not prepared to be a spectator. He decided to jump in and be an advocate and a champion for change. And he chose the route towards the development of his society, in which I think it was emblematical that it was born in 1937, where that was an entire break from the past to look to the future. And he entered there, was born at that time, found the situation as it was, and decided that he would, through entry into politics, through his contribution in education, effect change. And some of the legacy that we have is in education and creating that opportunity for the masses. The Barbados Community College has been an institution that democratized education, certainly post-secondary education in Barbados, by creating not just increased opportunity of the same sort, but an entire new dimension to post-secondary education beyond the traditional sixth form education. We saw as well the contribution which the social partnership continues to make towards our form of national governance. I had the good fortune of being the chairman of the subcommittee of social partners for 1995 to 2003. And that continues to work. And I support all that has been said. He has been an environmentalist, the significance and the geopolitical significance of the SIDS conference in Barbados, and putting small island developing states issues on the agenda, having a Barbados program of action which went to the Rio program, and it goes on and on. But those were things that were not about just the transactional politics of the day, but transformational matters, which he knew he may not see through to the end, but he also knew that it was not his to not put his hand to the wheel. Make the start, even if you don't see it to the end, you're not waiting for perfection. You do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You know perfection cannot be achieved, you do your good and you roll. So I thank everyone for their comments. Just an interesting personal twist in the 2 seconds that I'm giving myself. Sir Lloyd, it turns out, was the Member of Parliament of my wife when she was a child. She's from Beaconsfield, and my long lived there for many years as well after my wife married me and left. And her mother always believed in Almara and Sandiford as two who sent school her children, because they were born at that point where the access to a larger number of secondary schools and that they were free, provided opportunities for people to really see in real life terms what policy decisions made by governments, the impact that it could have on their lives. Interestingly enough, when our daughter was at Barbados Community College, 2006 to 8 from my memory, Sonoy was one of our lecturers. And there's an interesting little story there. There was a discussion on the reflection of the politics of the early 90s. And one youngster was a little rough, a little unkind to his lecturer in terms of the lecturer's actions during that time. And one of the people who kind of came to his defense by citing context and making the point that governments sometimes have to do things that are not driven by popularity, by what needs to be done in the moment, was my daughter. And he inquired, who she was. And the rest is history. For me, before I actually met him, I was a young officer at the Barbados Investment, well, it was then Barbados Industrial Development Corporation. I was asked to draft a speech for the opening of the Donnelly Graphics building in Wildy, which is now occupied by another business, but right on the corner there, around 1990-ish or so. And I thought it was going to be used by Minister of Trade, who would have been Philip.
Graves.
No, not Philip, the other Graves. Evelyn Graves at the time. But the Prime Minister himself, Prime Minister Sandiford, came and opened the building. And I'm pleased to say that he used my speech in its entirety, but he added on a little dimension on it. It was just a year ahead of the elections upcoming, so he added a piece. But I was honored that a Prime Minister used my words in that context. And then I met him then when I was at the Barbados Chamber of Commerce as executive director, and we were in the early days of forming a social partnership, so I was part of the team on behalf of the Barbados Private Sector Agency, and the rest, as they say, is history. And I can support all that has been said about his approach and his demeanor, his resoluteness, and I certainly wish you, Gareth, thank you very much for being here. I know that you have other obligations today, and I thank you for staying with us for some time. Please convey the best wishes and sympathies of the Honourable Senate. The resolution which Senator Cummins so ably moved will be communicated and shared with your family through the usual process. And I ask all honourable senators to stand with me in a moment of silence as we pass this resolution. Thank you. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And on behalf of the Honourable the Senate, I want to express our appreciation for you joining us today. I know you have a commitment for 2:30, and so I was behind here egging and watching the time fairly carefully. So thank you for staying with us, colleagues. The Senate is now adjourned until 3:30 promptly in the afternoon.
You're moving the adjournment.
It's suspended.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 3:30 p.m. today. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This sitting is therefore suspended until 3:30 p.m. today.